We'd met Lisa a couple of months before we tried it for the first time. She was new to school, and just different. She seemed to be ahead of her years, but still a little aloof. Anyway, one Friday lunchtime she asked if we'd ever used a Ouija board before. I'd never heard of it, but Kelly, who we were also with, loved things like that and said she'd always wanted to give it a go. Lisa said that we should try it after school and told us to head to the girls' locker room after the last class. Nobody went in there after school, and the janitor locked up quite late, so we'd have a few hours to use the board, which Lisa would quickly fetch from home as she only lived a few streets away. A few hours later, we were ready. Lisa set up the board and explained how it worked with the planchette and everything. I was excited but not necessarily scared until we were about to begin, and Lisa told us to never ask the spirit how it died. That got to me a little bit, but we started anyway. In that first 30 minutes, nothing really happened, except for us laughing a lot and Lisa asking some rather personal questions which set Kelly and me off. A few times it felt like the planchette moved on its own, but not with enough certainty to freak me out or anything. Then it all changed. Lisa had said goodbye to the last supposed spirit, and we asked if anyone else was there. There was a few seconds pause, and the planchette moved quickly to the word yes. We all looked at each other. This was real now. Lisa composed herself and asked the spirit its name. Kelly screamed as the planchette launched to the letter D, and it quickly spelled out the name, Derek. We then asked where it was, and it spelled out the word dead. In fact, the next few questions were replied to with the word dead, and once it said East London. And then it started to get vulgar. This was disturbing, and I really didn't like it. We said goodbye and took our hands off the planchette as it was spelling something out. Now I can tell you that the planchette moved on its own. It was trying to finish whatever it was spelling, but it came to a slow stop, like it ran out of power or something. We all sat there, shocked. But the worst was yet to come. Before we even had time to discuss what had happened, we heard this horrible labored breathing sound, like the way an old person breathes. It sounded like it was coming from behind the row of lockers next to us. Because we couldn't see who it was, I meekly asked if Mr. Phillips, the janitor, was there, hoping it was him. There was no reply. We were beyond scared, and that breathing continued. Unfortunately, to get out, we'd have to get past that row of lockers and see whatever was there. Lisa stood up. She was terrified, I could tell, but she whispered that we needed to leave. There was a strange comfort in the fact that it seemed as if Lisa was volunteering to go first. Kelly and I stood, knees like jelly, and held hands. Lisa counted down from 3 and we moved. I couldn't help but look. Some part of me just had to know what was there, but to my surprise, the small changing area where we heard the breathing was empty. No ghost. For a moment, I let myself believe that somehow I'd imagined a lot of what had happened in the past 20 minutes, but I was sadly mistaken. We only saw it as we turned the corner. It sneered at us, baring its yellow, rotting teeth. I thought later on that it didn't seem like a traditional ghost. I mean, it wasn't floaty or misty. It was solid and so horrible. It growled at us, and we got past it and just ran, waking later at home with uncontrollable shakes. I'm told that what we experienced was very rare, and probably wouldn't have happened if we'd been with someone who actually knew what they were doing, as Lisa clearly didn't. But I'd urge anyone listening to this not to try the Ouija board.
A few months back, I was working with my friends Tom and Gina, who hosted a weekly haunted event, usually on a Saturday night. They live-streamed mainly and were moderately successful. I just helped set up their equipment, as I was good with tech stuff. The night in question was freezing cold, and we had to go to a rundown apartment block in Newark called Saracen Heights. It sucked because they were hosting on the top floor, and the hall smelled of urine. There were gang signs on some of the walls, and as I was going in and out of the van, lugging equipment up and down the stairwell, eyes were on me. I was getting paid though, so I tried to keep that in mind. Over the years, anyone who had lived in apartment 53 had always complained sooner or later of strange paranormal disturbances, and that is where we set up the equipment. Tom and Gina were using a Ouija board on this particular night, and I'd set up motion sensors around the apartment, as well as the cameras. I called myself a half skeptic, but I didn't focus too much on what they were doing. I just needed to make sure that the equipment was running. It was about 9 p.m. when we were finally ready to begin. After the usual introduction and explanation of where they were, Tom and Gina held the planchette and started asking questions. I saw it move slowly on the board, but it was just so obviously them moving it. I get it though, they had to make it look like something was happening. Apparently they were speaking to a lady called Piper, who had lived in the area many years ago, before the apartment complex had even been built. She died sometime in the 1890s. Tom signaled for a minute's break and we played a message from the sponsor, and it was actually then that one of my sensors was tripped by the bathroom. Going live again, they mentioned what had happened and then continued with the board. After about 15 minutes into the second session, something changed. I'd never seen them get so excited so quickly. Gina began asking more questions and the planchette was moving quickly. Tom kept asking me to zoom in more with the camera, and I have to admit, it looked real. But the excitement was short-lived as something was wrong. Gina gasped and took her hand off the planchette. I mean, she pulled her arm back quick, as if she'd been bitten. Tom looked at her for a moment and she whispered something to him. He asked if she was sure and she said yes. Tom thought for a few seconds and actually ended the stream. He said that there was an emergency and needed to go, but that wasn't true. I didn't know what had happened, but they said they were calling it a night. I began packing up the equipment and taking it down to the van. Each time I went back up to the room, Tom was hugging Gina. She didn't seem upset exactly, more like in shock, I'd say, but Tom helped me with the computer and we all went down together. As we were making our way through the lobby, two guys came into the building. They approached us and asked if we'd been up to number 53. Tom said that we had, and one of them asked if we'd seen the crone and had she messed with us. When Tom asked what they meant, they both laughed and said we were lucky we didn't live in Saracen Heights. The next day, I looked through the photos taken and flicked back to when the sensor went off. I saw her and she was hideous. I presume the photo was of Piper, or the crone as those guys referred to her as. She was there the whole time. I never found out exactly what happened to Gina, but Tom said that when they were using the Ouija board, something very offensive about a deceased loved one from Gina's past was spelled out. After that night and that photo, I'm not a skeptic anymore.
My story happened a long time ago, in the mid-90s. I'd just gotten over glandular fever and was feeling somewhat better when my friends came over to see me. I think it was about an hour before most of them got bored, and they started to explore my house as my parents weren't in. It only took 5 minutes before a few of them found the basement door and went down there, hoping to find something exciting in the darkness. We followed them down there, and I'd forgotten how creepy it was. I rarely went down to the basement as I didn't have a reason to, apart from today, of course. My friend Mark was looking through some of the drawers when he found some old games. One of them was a Ouija board, which I had never used. It must have belonged to my grandmother. She liked things like that. Mark asked if we could use it, and I said okay. I mean, I had a vague idea of what they were, but didn't see it as a big deal, and they set it up. He'd obviously played before because he went through the rules of what to do and what not to ask the spirits. Of course, he got mocked, but he just talked on and had to use an old glass because there was no planchette. It must have got lost over the years. My friend Lori volunteered to play as well. The first thing they asked was if anybody was in the room, and the glass slid over to the yes section on the board. It was slow, and nobody believed that it was real. After half an hour, all of us had had a go, and nothing spectacular had happened to anybody. Mark said we should spice things up a little bit. There was an old wardrobe in the basement that I'd always found creepy. It was deep, and he suggested 2 of us go there to try the board, with the doors closed and only a torch. I okayed it. The wardrobe was empty anyway, and he said he'd try with Lori, so in they went. We heard laughing once they were in there, and I think one of them might have bumped their head. Then there was silence. Those of us who weren't inside the wardrobe began to look at each other as the silence was growing uncomfortable. Suddenly, a loud voice shouted, "Get out!" and the wardrobe doors burst open. Mark came out first, and Lori stumbled out of there. Mark, who was as white as a sheet, asked who said that. We didn't know what to tell him, and were just as scared as he was. I managed to calm both of them down. They explained that they'd briefly made contact, then smelled a foul smell in the wardrobe before they heard that voice shout at them. Shortly after that, everybody left. I didn't blame them, but I really didn't want to be alone either. I was still fairly ill, so I couldn't go out. All I could really do was lock the basement door and put TV on, then wait it out till my parents got home. It was just before midnight that I was woken up by a loud scream and my mother shouting that somebody had gotten into our home. The police were called and searched the entire house, including the basement, where my mother had been to look for a set of headphones. Peering out of the wardrobe down there, she saw an old man who shouted at her to get out. The police found nothing, of course, and it was my fault. We didn't stay in that house long after that, and I never used a Ouija board again.